Hello, teachers! In this first episode, we're going to be connecting two great houses of worship under the global theme of sacred spaces. The two sacred spaces we're going to be comparing are Chartres Cathedral, located in Chartres, France, and the Great Mosque of Cordoba, located in Cordoba, Spain. Sacred spaces are generally going to be architectural examples that accommodate some sort of religious worship. By the way, it might not hurt to mention here that the College Board suggests that 25% of your course coverage be devoted to architecture, and the exam students take each May is supposed to reflect that coverage expectation. So let's get started. If you teach your course in a chronological, linear fashion along a Western timeline, which I suggest because I feel beginning art history students need a basic foundation of a Western timeline to build off of, then before you get to the Gothic period, which is when Chartres Cathedral was built late in the medieval era, your students should have already learned about early Christian art. Early Christian art is art of the Christian Romans, both prior to and after the legalization of Christianity by Emperor Constantine during the late Roman Empire. So it lasted from around 300 to 500 CE. For the first time ever, Emperor Constantine had spaces of religious worship constructed for his Christian citizens. Instead of having his architects create a completely new type of structure for Christian worship, Constantine chose to adopt the layout of the civic basilica, which was sort of like an ancient courthouse, and he turned it into the earliest form of a Christian church, as can be seen in Old St. Peter's Basilica. Spaces for Christian worship gradually evolved from that point on, through the early medieval era, the Romanesque period, and then finally, they reached their pinnacle in the era of great stone and glass cathedrals during the Gothic period. When studying sacred spaces in AP Art history, understanding how the worshippers experience and utilize the sacred space for the purposes of their chosen religion is key for our students. In Catholic churches, worshippers gather in a space and focus on a priest who speaks at the head of the church and delivers communion. Priests stand at the altar, and communion is also given at the altar, which is located in front of the church in an area called the apse. In Catholic sacred spaces like Chartres Cathedral, the most sacred part of Mass is communion. This is the moment when Catholic believers receive the wafer and the wine at the altar, and something called transubstantiation occurs. Catholic believers feel that at this moment in Mass, the elements of the Eucharist that you receive actually become the blood and the body of Christ, as introduced by Christ himself at the Last Supper. Catholic sacred spaces therefore need to provide a relatively uninhibited view for all worshippers so they can see the space around the altar. The open nave and the side aisles usually provide this. If your students are given a sound foundation of the layout of Christian sacred spaces from the get-go, seeing how various Christian sacred spaces developed throughout the medieval era to accommodate Christian worshippers should be relatively easy for students to see and understand. By comparing and contrasting Chartres Cathedral with the Great Mosque of Cordoba, you can show your students two sacred spaces built within a few hundred years of one another. The Great Mosque of Cordoba was completed in 987, while Chartres was completed in 1220. And you can show them two sacred spaces that existed in neighboring countries, both France and Spain. But these sacred spaces represent two completely different religions. After covering Chartres Cathedral in class, it's a great time to introduce the fundamental basics of the Islamic religion to your students. Students should have a sound understanding of who the Prophet Muhammad was, what the 5 pillars of the Islamic faith are, and that the center of the Islamic world is Mecca, where the Kaaba is, and that followers of the Islamic faith are called Muslims. I have some great links to online resources that you can use in class listed below the video. One major difference between Christian churches and Islamic mosques is orientation. The center of the Islamic world is Mecca, and that is where all mosques must face in their closest direction. There is a wall in every mosque called the Qibla wall, which means the direction of Mecca, and it directs worshippers towards the holy city when they pray. They are supposed to pray towards Mecca 5 times a day. Each mosque has a muezzin, who calls Muslims to prayer 5 times a day. Muslims do not require the same uninhibited view as Christians do when they attend mosque, because whereas Christians must see the altar, Muslims only need to face towards Qibla. They don't actually need to see the wall, so their needs are being accommodated if they simply face Qibla when they pray. Mosques are thought to have taken their form from the original mosque built by the Prophet Muhammad next to his home in Medina. The Prophet Muhammad's mosque was said to have been built with a series of palm trunks arranged like columns that supported a roof, patched with palm fronds. To this day, the majority of mosques in the world are largely composed of a massive hypostyle hall, which is a large room supported by rows of columns. Islamic mosques are also very different from Christian churches because Muslims do not allow any graven images within mosques. So, Muslim sacred spaces are filled with decorative patterns called arabesque and tessellations, while Christian churches are usually littered with actual images of biblical figures. After you introduce the basics of Islam, especially the requirements of Muslim prayer and the strict rules regarding no graven images, start your students towards comparing and contrasting the two sacred spaces by showing them a floor plan of each of the spaces at the same time side by side. Ask your students to carefully analyze the floor plans of both spaces in relationship to what they now know about the requirements of each religion's practices. Start with the floor plans. Ask them to compare and contrast both plans. What differences can they identify? Based on what they now know about the religions of Christianity and Islam, how does the layout of the spaces that they see in front of them fit with the religious practices of both Christianity and Islam? After examining the plans, students should be able to defend their observations by relating elements of the plans that they can see to the practices of each religion that they have just learned. Next, move on to the decorations. Ask your students to compare and contrast some of the decorative elements that you show them in class. Ask them how the decorations found in each sacred space reflect the beliefs of those religions. Foundational information about the religions that utilize a sacred space is the key to understanding them. Each religion has its own unique practices and rituals that require their sacred spaces to be designed to accommodate them. Without understanding the religion in question, students will have a hard time comprehending any sacred space they study throughout the year. Christian sacred spaces are by far the most plentiful type of space we study with our students throughout the year, so there are plenty of other opportunities to do cross-cultural connections throughout the year with other sacred spaces that will allow students to understand religions beyond Islam. Some of the works I suggest doing cross-cultural comparisons with throughout the year are the Great Stupa of Sanchi, a Buddhist stupa in India, Angkor Wat, a Hindu temple in Cambodia, El Castillo, a Mayan stepped pyramid in Mexico, and Borobudur, a Buddhist temple in Java, Indonesia. Don't forget to check out the links below. Be sure to tune in to our next episode that discusses the theme of power and authority.